Hi, guys. Welcome back to episode 3 of our weekly Pulse podcast. So, it's our other half of our podcast that we do alongside the Spotlight guest series that we run. I am introducing today's call because James has been away for the last few days. So, I've been kind of picking up the reins to make sure things are running smoothly. And hopefully, it
Show on
has
the road.
been
Keeping the show on the road.
keeping the show on the road. And hopefully, we haven't crashed. So,
No, I think you've done a better job than normal. I think I'll stay away for longer, mate.
it's all good. We've managed to get the newsletter out this week. Really interesting stories looking back at the history of AI. And we also look at some events within the product delivery
Yeah.
sector. We look at how investment is soaring within the industry. So there's so much to catch up on, but it looks like macro level changes to some extent, James. So
Yeah.
it'll be good to kind of get your views on some of the things that we've covered this week. But I'll introduce them as we go because I know you've been away.
Cool. Well, I'm really excited for this podcast simply because I've just come back from a long weekend away with some friends, did a bit of a song writing retreat, and it was meant to be a no AI weekend, although that didn't quite go to plan, and I'll explain about that on another episode where we did actually introduce a little bit of AI into what we were doing. But apart from that, I had absolutely zero visibility. I was totally off grid, off comms. So coming back to this to literally, I just got back today to have a chat with you, Yoshi, and you can tell me about what's happened and what's been going on over the course of the last sort of week or so.
Yeah, so there's been a lot really. I mean, we kind of introduced the first topic, and if you look at the headline of the newsletter that we released this week, it touches on AI's first winter.
Mm.
And this was to kind of give more context as to what an AI winter is. It was a period of disillusionment and
Mm.
reduced funding across artificial intelligence research,
Mm.
dating back to 1970s. So within the newsletter, we can see a graph, and that kind of showcases the AI bubble that we had, and also the winter which occurred as a result of that bubble bursting. Now, when you look in history, there's been three bubbles, right? So again, one that happened in the 1960s to 70s of when it bursted, another in and around the 90s, 80s to the 1997 when it bursted again, and
Mm.
now we're on this kind of third generation of an AI bubble, which is got some things which are reminiscent of what happened before, but also things that are different. The main thing to kind of talk about today, James, is get our opinions on: are we going on a different trajectory, or is there a burst awaiting us down the line, effectively?
Yeah, well, of course, we had the dot-com burst as well back in the early 2000s, which was another one of these. I think naturally these things go in these sort of ebbs and flows. But I think it's quite interesting that the very fact that we're talking about AI bubbles back in the 50s and 60s, it kind of reinforces what we've been talking about quite a lot on this podcast, which is AI is nothing new. It's been around for a long, long time. Obviously, it's a lot more powerful, and generative AI is now here. But we kind of get this hype, don't we? As humans, we think
Mm.
it's going to solve all of our problems, and then lo and behold, it doesn't quite do what we wanted it to do, and there's a little bit of disillusionment, which is what the Gartner hype cycle is. So anyone who doesn't know what the Gartner hype cycle is, it's well worth checking it out. I think there's a link to it in the newsletter, isn't there?
Yeah,
Because
there is.
yeah, all walks of life, it really kind of it holds true. So the previous, I remember the 1997 burst. I remember being around an arcade in the Trocadero in London around that time, and the first VR kind of game came out, and it was simply a case of the technology was not ready yet. I mean, a lot of the great sci-fi films around AI came out in that period, the sort of late 80s, early 90s. So
Yeah.
basically our imaginations were going faster than the ability of the tech. So obviously we got let down, and everyone said, "Well, we're not quite ready for that yet." I think the difference this time is the tech is ready. So I've got a
Yeah.
feeling that if there is a winter, and there's bound to be a little bit of a you know trough of disillusionment, as the Gartner hype cycle calls it. But I've
Mm.
got a feeling it might be quite short lived because I think genuinely the tech is there now.
Yeah, and that's kind of what was happening back when we look at the first and second AI winter. So the first time round, AI was unheard of, right? A lot of development was quite nascent. People weren't familiar with what it was, and it was a big jump in terms of an advancement within the times, right? So the reason why the bubble kind of burst at that point was a report from a guy called Sir James Lighthill, and he kind of published the Lighthill report, and what this said was that AI hasn't got the hardware or the infrastructure for us to be able to deliver it effectively. And this is an issue that we're seeing repeated throughout history, and it's a big movement right now. And that's the reason why a lot of companies are investing in AI infrastructure. I mean, we're seeing $1 trillion right in the next couple of years. But then, so that was one issue which led to that AI winter and that bubble burst. And then when it came to the second wave, when it came to development of AI, it became a lot more niche and more specific.
Yeah.
So rather than saying AI in general, you started to see some conceptualizations around neural networks, which form today in kind of deep learning. You had OCR, so optical character recognition, speech recognition, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So development became a bit more specific and niche. So it was easier to understand some of the use cases involved. However, that bubble then burst again because what people realized was, again, the infrastructure wasn't there, and the ability to achieve AI or deploy it at scale again was an issue because we didn't have this computing power,
Yeah.
right? So there was no hardware to run these things off. In addition to, okay, a lot of the perception at the time of AI was for it to be used within scientific breakthroughs, right, and medicinal fields, etc., etc. What the issue was that running these tests within labs doesn't always equate to real world application, right?
No,
So
and it was almost like they were trying to skip a step. Like you said, we had to go through this kind of computer revolution first, the microchip revolution, where computers and smartphones became an everyday part of our life before you could then go on. It was almost like it was a couple steps too soon.
exactly. And this is why I think this time round, the trajectory that we're on at the moment is very different. I mean, the capital is there, the
Yeah,
investment is, I mean, like I mentioned, we're talking billions and trillions being invested into the AI infrastructure. And the developments are also based in tangible progress, and they have good commercial viability. So for
mm,
instance, with ChatGPT, right, it's a bit like what Apple did with their devices, is they brought it to consumers, right? So they were integrating their hardware into people's lives. And
mm,
this same thing with ChatGPT. You can look at it to get travel. You can look at it to understand food. You can get it to understand to write emails. You can use it for everything. So that ability, that commercial aspect, has what enabled kind of this big, massive adoption of AI software, which hadn't happened before.
yeah. No, I think it is a very different set of circumstances. I remember being at university, it must have been about 1997, and a lot of people, I was doing a course in quantity surveying, and a lot of people said to me, why are you doing this? It's going to be, it's going to be overtaken by, I don't know if it was called AI, but computers or the tech revolution. And a lot of the things that were being warned against me then are now true. The things like BIM being as mature as it is now, things like generative AI, that's kind of what people are warning against. And it's just taken that length of time, that sort of 20, 25 years to get to that point. So even though, going back to the newsletter and the AI winter, I think there'll be my prediction is there'll be a slight dip over the course of the next sort of 9 months or so in terms of the hype. I think we already saw it, didn't we, with the McDonald's advert and things like that, where people start saying, oh, well, these are the reasons why it's not going to have a profound impact. But then I think, as GPT-5 model comes out, and then the new versions of the Sora comes out, and, these different models start becoming more and more mature, I think that'll be very, very short-lived.
Yeah, and I think also looking at AI above and beyond just generative AI and large language models. All right, I
Yeah.
think when you look at it within that lens, you're only seeing the negatives of that form of AI. But when
Mm.
you're looking at kind of like AI from multimodality sort of perspectives, things start to change and the optics start to change, the perception starts to change. But also, one thing I'd like people to think about is in this time, there is an abundance of software in the market. Software is huge.
Mm.
So when AI has then been developed and it's been productionized and deployed, it's being deployed into software much easier. There's less friction for it to be deployed to the masses because software is already existing. So the
Yeah.
suitability and the interoperability, maybe if you look at it that way, has become a lot more seamless. Hence, the adoption
I think that
is
the other side to that coin is that it serves to confuse people slightly, because every single piece of software is being sold as being AI powered, and it's not
yeah.
always true. Or it depends what definition of AI you're talking about. But the definition of AI, when I talk about this latest AI revolution, I'm really talking about generative AI stuff that really kind of does. It's what we've talked about before, moving from a tool to an agent. That's my definition. Whereas a lot of these tools, there's nothing really different there. Yes, there may be a bit of machine learning going on, but it's fundamentally just a relatively minor change from the previous software, and that confuses people. I think where they don't see a massive change, it just says AI powered. What does that actually mean?
Exactly, because people just put that wrapper on, like you said.
It's a sales pitch now. It's almost that you're at a disadvantage if you don't say you've got AI.
Yeah, and I guess with commercial deployment, you have the added aspect of marketing,
Yeah,
and marketing is a powerful engine. And it's not always the best product which typically sells. I know there's a saying that cream rises to the top, but often it's good marketing.
yeah.
Strong
I'm
marketing is going to
I'm
get you
still
something.
convinced there's going to be a reaction with a lot of people starting to say this is a service or a product or a whatever it may be without AI, no AI involved. I think that's coming down the line, and that could work for consultants as well. I can imagine some consultants going niche, saying, "Yeah, we only have humans." I don't know how long that will take, but if there's a lesson from any history,
That's
that
a
could.
good point you mentioned, though. You
Yeah.
mentioned because it's like when Apple started to release their product, they never used to mention the word AI, even though they had it in a lot of their devices. When you look at the bioinformatics they had with their watches, it was already AI powered and never mentioned it. But they did seem to jump on the wave when they did their announcement, a few months back.
Well, I think that they changed tack, didn't they? Because the WWDC before this one, they didn't mention the word AI, and
Mm,
they were putting everything into their, I think their autonomous vehicle and the headset, the
mm.
Vision Pro, and that hasn't been a success yet. Although give it time, I believe it will be a success in future. But I think they've had to do a pretty quick U-turn and jump on the bandwagon,
Jump on the
that's
bandwagon,
why
yeah.
they've ended up having to do a partnership in part with OpenAI because they just weren't developing their own models fast enough, and they've had to find a way of getting on the bandwagon, I believe.
Exactly. And so you look at this discrepancy between this age of AI that we currently have now, and this third generation. You look at the old AI from the AI winters of the first and second bubbles. And one of the big things which stuck out was ChatGPT, right? So ChatGPT was a revolution across the industry and it brought AI to the forefront, to the public domain, right?
Mhm.
And just kind of following one of the tip of the weeks that we had, which we can kind of pick up a bit more here,
Oh yeah,
is we are always looking at ways to improve what value we can get off our AI models. And everyone uses ChatGPT. So within the newsletter, we
well,
were looking at
I'd say everyone, probably most people who are listening to this too, but there's a lot of people who still haven't used it. I did a presentation the other day, and I was surprised by the percentage of people who'd never used it.
yeah,
So
it's
I think
just
we've
I
got to
mean,
remember
the adoption was crazy. What was the adoption back in? It was like they had, was it 100 million users
in
in
5 days.
5 days? In 5 days, yeah. So it's weird because you think of that, you think, okay, everyone knows about it, but you're right. I was in the call to someone who hadn't used
Yeah,
ChatGPT.
there are people who haven't used it for sure. So I think we've got to remember that because we live in a bit of a, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners are people who are interested in this subject. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that there are people out there who either don't know about it or they're fearful of it or they've tried it once and they didn't like or they didn't understand it. And it's part of our role, I think, to ease those people into it and make sure they realise that this technology isn't going away. So we've got to get up to speed with it and that it's nothing to be scared of.
Yeah, yeah. And
So
on
what you
that
want to talk about
topic,
now is, yeah, it's really important.
yeah, but on that topic then, so when you come to use things like ChatGPT, I remember when I first used ChatGPT and I was asking some questions, I was getting some outputs, and I was trying to kind of score how good the AI was.
Mm.
Then as months go down the line and you become more familiar with the tool, you kind of recognize yourself some of these techniques to get more value out of the models.
Yeah,
So for those of you who have just started ChatGPT, we've got an article in the newsletter which talks about how you can squeeze more value from your prompts. To give you some more context about this, there's kind of a saying whereby when you come to use an AI model within generative AI, a rule of thumb is to be unambiguous, precise, and instructive as possible when giving the AI a prompt. Now, the reason for this is because AI works off its knowledge base and it makes an inference of what you're expecting an answer to be. When we typically use ChatGPT, we'll ask it a question, okay? And this technique, a simple question like, I don't know, what's the capital of France? And it might say Paris, okay? Now, that in itself is a technique called zero shot prompting. And that's when you ask a question and there's no examples. However, did you know, James, that you can, and you probably do know this, but you can improve the value you get from your AI outputs if you use a technique called few shot prompting.
yeah, yeah.
Now, few shot prompting is basically where you ask a question and you also give an example of how you want the AI to respond. Have you done that before? Have you given that a go?
Yeah, I think I've picked that up just through trial and error. Really, it's like, where you give it more information and you can give it a case study or an example to point to. So, for instance, you can get. Let's take a simple example. You want
Mm.
it to write an email, but you can say write an email. But then, if you then paste an email that you want it to follow in, say in this style, you're giving it a bit more context. And in the context of project delivery, if you're asking it to write a project plan, you could just say write a project plan and it will do something for you. But if you've got a template or something in mind and you provide that information, say in the style of this, and that's the beauty of ChatGPT, you can upload things,
Mm.
use this as a template or use this as an influence or use this as inspiration, you'll get a better response, undoubtedly. So I've kind of worked that out by trial and error. I didn't know there was a name for it. So I have learned something.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to go away more, definitely, Yoshi.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I can bring more some more of these techniques. There's loads of different techniques, right? But yeah, and it's proven to work quite effectively. And you can kind of get this within sentiment analysis. So, for instance, with sentiment analysis, okay, back in the day when it was quite immature, you'd have you'd have the AI storing the internet or different tweets, for instance, and it would say something like, okay, this movie is sick, right?
Mm.
And it would typically associate sick as a negative word, so it would struggle to provide you with a valid output. But what you could do in this instance is you can give it a prompt, and then you can give an example to say, okay, this is the word sick, and this is how I've used it. It will then understand that all within that chat interface. So you can by giving it more context, it's able to give you a more reliable and valid output. So that's something called few shot prompting,
That
and
makes
it,
sense, right? It's the same as if you're speaking to. So if you're speaking to a human being, if you say to them, produce something or do a report without any context, the
mm,
chances of that output being what you want is lower than if you gave that person an example. So in some ways, you treat it exactly the same as you would when you're given a brief or an instruction to a human being.
exactly. Are there any other techniques you've tried, James, when you're using your AI models?
I mean, we've talked about the memory feature in ChatGPT, which I use a lot. That's a good way of just not repeating the same mistake. I think I don't know. I don't know about you. Sometimes I know it makes absolutely no difference, but speaking to it in a human manner and trying to just get that what's in your head out sometimes helps, even to the point of saying please. Because I think that if you can speak to it in a way that you would do to anyone else,
Mm,
your thoughts, your clarity is going to be there. Whereas if you start second guessing yourself, thinking that it's a piece of computer code or an algorithm, I think that's where you go wrong. You've got to remember these large language models understand the intonations and the tone that you're trying to give it. So the more you give it, the better. And I'll tell you what I do use. A big hint is you don't always have to type. You can use the speech feature
yes,
and
yes.
talk into it, because then you really do talk in a natural way and then things just flow. I think we get that kind of stage fright, don't we, where we sometimes when we use the voice features, like I'm on mic, but if you talk to it just as if you were your stream of consciousness coming out and you're saying what you want and what you wanted to do, your prompt can go on for as long as you want. So just that's one thing I've definitely learned to do. Stop using the type. Use the voice feature when you can.
Yeah, because I guess that's a lot more conversational as well. So depending on how you learn, if you learn more through auditory sort of stimuli or kind of what's written down, it's probably depending on what you prefer, right?
Yeah, and that's getting us prepared for the forthcoming voice feature, which has been delayed. I know we had ChatGPT on the podcast a few weeks ago, but that was the old version, believe it or not. That was the one where you've got to wait for a response to finish. The new voice features coming out anytime now, which will be a much more conversational and with very very little latency. So I think we're all going to have to get used to using voice to prompt these models anyway. So it's just a change. We're so used to having to type things. It's going to take a bit of a culture change as well.
Exactly. So let's look at the next topic.
Yeah.
And this is something that you'll be quite familiar with, James, because the people who have kind of worked on this event and kind of the highlight material which came off the back of it, we know them quite well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is an event summary from what the Major Projects Association did with their event, looking into the landscape of AI. So in this, it's kind of cool. I'll just read a quote from Mark Enzer, who was the chair of this event at the time, and it said it's really good for us to recognize that underneath all the exciting possibilities of AI, there needs to be some really hard work to get our data right. because if the data isn't right, then the AI isn't right either. And there also needs to be some hard work to sort out the skills that we need to work appropriately with the AI and to deploy it well. Put simply, data and skills are essentially foundations for effective AI. So what are your thoughts on that, James?
Well, the work Mark Enns is doing with Project 13 and then Andy Murray's doing Major Project Association is really, really important. And he's part of the Project Data Analytics Task Force, which obviously we're associated with. So I think we're all saying the same thing, which is exactly what Mark's saying here. We know that we're poor with our data, and there's that old saying, which is the best time to plant an oak tree was 20 years ago or today. In the absence of having planted an oak tree, I get our data in order 20 years ago. We've got to just start from where we are now. And I don't think that should put us off. So the work that these people were doing, and there's a few people like this around, is really, really important. We had the AI and project delivery paper from the IPA. I know there's similar things going on across the pond in the States. And I think, we are at the beginning, unfortunately, of a journey because we didn't plant that oak tree 20 years ago for whatever reason. And so we've just got to get on with the job of getting the data there. But I think what's equally important is the skills, because whilst the data is maturing, and we know from the work that we do within Gleeds, for instance, that it doesn't take long, actually. When we made a decision in one of our databases, for instance, to start it off from scratch, and it was a bold decision, I think, but you think to yourself, oh my God, everything starts from scratch. But even a year in, you'll be surprised what happens after a year. And we know how fast a year can go. So I think everyone just starting, following what Mark's talking about here, which is just getting your data in order. And it can be baby steps, but then at the same time, it shouldn't be a case of waiting. At the same time, getting the data skills in. And I know most organisations are doing things in this regard. I know the APM are doing stuff in terms of the body of knowledge. I know the RICS are doing an AI working practices guide, which I'm helping, to advise on. And they're also talking about changing the APC, so the qualifications to become a chartered surveyor, to make sure there's some kind of AI or data skills involved. So there's nothing there I don't agree with, because I think what Mark's doing and what we're doing in the Project Data Analytics Task Force is all part of the same puzzle. I see it as a Venn diagram. It all overlaps in the middle, which is all around this data and the data skills. And then there's kind of slightly different tangents in terms of what the focus is. But yeah, there's nothing there I want to agree with. I think the work Mark's doing is fantastic, and also what the Major Projects Association is doing is fantastic.
And there was a few questions in there on the summary where they point to some points of further discussion. And I'll just read one of them. And it was around, how do we communicate the opportunities of AI in a way that becomes accessible to people in order to encourage adoption rather than to reject it as too scary? And the reason why I kind of picked this question is because this relates back to the first point of the AI winters. One of the biggest factors for why there was a burst in the first and second bubble was this idea of adoption, because it couldn't scale effectively. But then now what we're saying is that we don't think it's going to happen again because it's easily deployed, right? There's loads of distribution lines that these big companies have where they can adopt it easily, and there's no way that it's not going to get to the masses. So what do you think is the best way to communicate the opportunities of AI in a way that can make it accessible to people?
Yeah. So I think we mustn't scare people, and I think sometimes the people in this bubble are sometimes guilty of, like we talked about earlier on, like, oh, everyone's used ChatGPT. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that people coming in this at different entry points and making everyone feel like, we don't want people to turn themselves off because they think, oh, I'm too far gone. Because the tech's moving so fast, for someone even moving in now, they would have missed out on maybe a year or 18 months worth of learning that we've been lucky enough to experience. But that doesn't mean it's very difficult to get to grips with it, but we mustn't. So I think it's a gentle encouragement and reminding people that it's not too late. This isn't like learning a programming language where, there's loads of work. It's quite a shallow learning curve, I think, to learn some of these tools, to learn how to use ChatGPT and how to get your data in good order and how to get some of these relatively basic visualization skills that you can use with data, such as Power BI. So I think the main thing we do is to be encouraging to don't try and be holier than thou with people to like, oh, you got to use this, because people come at this when they're ready, and people come at it for different reasons. Some people will just realise they've got to get on the bus. Other people might have a shock. There may be a shock to their career that they realise they have to do it, and we don't want anyone ever to feel like it's too late for me, or it's too far gone. So
Okay,
I think
question for you then.
it's a human thing more than a tech thing.
A question for you then, James. So you've seen Men in Black, right? I'm assuming you've seen Men in Black.
Do you know what? If I have, it's been a very long time ago.
Okay, so in Men in Black, they have this this tool. It's like a device, and
Yeah.
it's like a light, and then they slap the light, and whoever looks at it, completely their memory is wiped,
Oh,
blank slate clean. Okay, so let's say you're in the Men in Black. They've just done this device. Your memory is completely wiped blank, and someone says to you, James, the thing called AI is changing the world. What is the first three things that you do to help you understand and get involved with it, or would you not?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's all about showing people. So seeing is believing. So we can talk about this to the cows come home. The best thing to do would be sit down with someone to show you this is how easy it is. Whatever tool that may be, whether that's ChatGPT, whether that's Power BI, whether it's any other kind of software, and just guiding them through it, because I'm assuming that they've still got their kind of basic cognitive skills, and it's just a case of they've gone back to a time before these tools were available. So you know what I mean? It is a learning curve. It's not like you're learning to code in Python, something like that, which is quite a steep learning curve. We're talking about a lot of this is human language, and it's saying, right, this is the way that you do your job currently, and by using these tools, you could do this, and give some examples. So you could use the example. I'd probably want someone to just take me through an example of how you could create a report using AI, or maybe the simple one. This is how you get a really good email written using it.
Yeah,
because that's kind of the most basic way, and how most people got started on the.
yeah. So I was actually we were using the Glees version of ChatGPT today that we built, and we were running a walkthrough with some beta testers within Glees, and we looked at some of the feedback that we got, and the main use for people using the solution that we had built is because of emails.
That's fine. So I know there's some people say, "Oh, you're not using it to its full potential," and which is true. But I'll go back to that point, which is you don't want to discourage people, because then people think, "Oh, I'm not using it properly. I'll just go back to what I'm doing." Let them use it for emails to start with, because that's a really good introduction. It's relatively safe, and then hopefully that'll get their brains going. So, if it does it for that, what can I do for this?
And then that's the lesson for a lot of companies who are using AI and trying to find that product market fit, right? It's you have to be human centric, because the human is what drives the adoption at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And I think it's if there's one thing that we can do with the kind of communication we're doing with Project Flux, and the whole reason our whole reason we started this off was to make people feel comfortable, because I was feeling overwhelmed with the amount of news out there. So the ability for someone to get a newsletter or to get a half an hour podcast and just tune in and find out what's going on. So if ever, like for listeners, please, any feedback would be great. If we're not doing that, let us know, because we want to make this as simple as possible. We try and avoid kind of tech language too much. This is meant to be accessible and for you to share with people who may not know about it. I'd say that genuinely this should be a good resource for people to get started with. That's the whole reason we started this, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. No, it's exactly that. And kind of keeping on that topic then of adoption, because of the way humanity has adopted AI technology, AI development, we're starting to now see investments within big tech soaring. So we've got an article here, and it mentions that big tech companies, your Microsoft, Google, Alphabet, Meta, Amazon, are ramping up spending on AI infrastructure and talent. We know there are two massive issues currently in terms of how we scale AI, which caused the first two bursts, right? Is infrastructure and also talent, is making sure that we actually build what we're capable of building, because there's a lot of money, there's a lot of investment based on a stipulation as to where AI is going to go. And if we fall short, the fallout could be damaging. Experts are estimating currently that these kind of big tech companies are going to invest over 1 trillion in AI in the next 5 years into infrastructure and talent. Microsoft and Amazon alone have allocated 40 billion for AI related projects and data centers worldwide so far. And as a result of these investments, the AI spending is fueling concerns among some investors about whether the cost will pay off in the near term.
Yeah.
There's a specific analyst who estimates the tech industry needs to generate 600 billion in annual AI revenue to justify the current level of infrastructure spending. So there's a lot to unpack there. What it
Yeah.
looks like at the moment is that people are committed to development of AI, and this is what we're talking about, the trajectory of it. There's so much investment going into the hardware, the infrastructure laid out by, I mean, for instance, NVIDIA were at one point last month the most valuable company in the
Yeah.
world, right?
That's all right.
So people are investing into AI infrastructure. So there's so much that we're going at that surely we're not going to fail, right?
Well, you say that, but you go back to 2000 and dot-com bubble. I'm sure there's some listeners who will remember that. And, there was equally crazy money going into, I remember like Cisco, for instance, as a telecoms company, and then it had that massive, massive crash. So it doesn't necessarily mean it can't fail. And I think there are a lot of people just trying to get on the bandwagon. So there is every possibility that there could be a crash. It doesn't mean this tech won't take off, but there could be a similar thing happen. Because I think a lot of people are investing, they're not sure exactly what the business case is. They just know they've got to be in it.
Mm.
And especially the mid-sized company, I think the big five that we mentioned in the newsletter, they've got a very clear plan, and it's an arms race. But for some companies sort of in that middle range, or even some of the SMEs involved in our sector, the project delivery sector, I think a lot of them are just, they know they've got to be in it. They're not. Do you remember like when the internet started, people, they knew that they weren't quite sure what a website could do, but they just knew they needed one. And so they'd spend some money to get a website built. And they weren't quite sure where it was going. Nobody really understood what e-commerce was in those days, and how it could benefit you, and how it could become part of the monetization strategy for the company. I think it's the same thing here. It's like there's a lot of companies trying to lean into it because they know it's here, and they don't want to be left out. It's a FOMO experience more than anything else. But there is every opportunity. There could be a crash similar to the dot-com crash. That doesn't mean the tech won't continue to increase, but that could happen. So kind of watch this space, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, like I mentioned, so some of these incumbents have access to deep pools of resources like these big companies. They've got the economies of scale. And that means if they are to fail somewhat, they do have a lot of resources where they can allocate AI to other things. So there's a lot of other options that they can leverage if this does happen. I guess one of the things that we can look at, again, going back to our initial story of the first winter and as to why commercialization is actually maybe potentially a saving grace for AI at the moment, is that playing devil's advocate, when you start to commercialize products, you then have pressures from above and some of these big investments or investors asking, saying, well, you need to release this, right? And that pressure might lead to, and it does happen to a lot of companies releasing kind of subpar products, right? And again, you take that even further. That's probably why Ilya Sutskever, who developed Safe Superintelligence company, has developed it as a lab, right? To find the truth, to do it, to achieve safe superintelligence without the commercial pressures. There's that devil's advocate whereby, yes, it might fail because of these pressures for commercialization. However, with the economies of scale, these big companies have access to massive distribution networks, so the likeliness of their products not hitting the mainstream is going to be highly unlikely. So there will be an impact, whether that's through scientific breakthrough or if that is now through a kind of a commercial aspect and how it changed the way that we live our lives and how we consume as consumers. I think the fallout won't be as damaging. I don't think we'll fall as much as we would in the first few.
The dot-com bubble bursting didn't stop the takeoff of the personal computer and the smartphone era. So it won't, whatever happens there with the markets and the investment, that what happens. It's no reason not to do what we talked about before in terms of getting the data in order, carry on building your data skills, because all it will be a blip anyway. It'll be a blip, and it will be a market correction because probably some of these companies have been massively overvalued, and it'll be a correction, and then it will be, but the overall trend will be up.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
It's I mean, and you look at it, and it is a big risk, but it's a risk people are willing to take. One trillion AI. I mean, that's more than I've got in my savings account, just about. But it's a huge thing. Anyway, before we I mean, we're probably drawing to a close soon.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to mention because I found this quite interesting. So looking at the AI winter, it was looking at the inception of AI, and it mentioned the Turing test.
Oh yeah,
Okay, as a method to understand whether or not how advanced AI can be and how it can mimic human intelligence. We know that a lot of AI models can now pass the Turing test, right? And I saw someone the other day mentioned that there's a new Turing test. Now, do you know what that is?
I don't know what the new one is, but go on. I know you're
It's
going to tell me.
gymnastics.
Go on.
It's gymnastics. You know,
What
you have a
bit?
lot of AI video creation. If you someone asked many different AI models to develop a video of someone doing gymnastics, you know, you got the pummel horse and all that
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
And if you look at the video, it is completely so far off what it
Yeah,
should be.
that's.
And it's now said, okay, so you know when it had the Will Smith eating the spaghetti, and now
I, I
people are
saw the one
eating.
on the Tour de France as well, which was absolutely ridiculous. Where it
Yeah,
just handle it.
yeah. So we were here last year saying this when Will Smith was eating spaghetti, not literally. I mean, it was an AI of him eating spaghetti. And fast forward to a few months back, there was another person eating some food, and it was really good. So the improvement has changed. So we're looking at this point now, saying, okay, gymnastics is a new Turing test. We're looking at years time. We're going to see people doing gymnastics that I've never even seen. But it's going to be,
Well, let's keep that on there, and then in a year's time, let's go back and see whether they. But there'll always be a new milestone, won't there? There'll always be a new benchmark. The fact
yeah,
that we're getting to there, saying right, this is the next test you've got to pass.
it's the next test, right? And
Mhm.
whether or not we see that soon, I mean, OpenAI have delayed the release of Sora. People are starting to get a bit frustrated. I mean, is there commercial pressures? We don't know.
Mm.
But from the outside looking in, just looking at the pure investment and looking at the fact that AI is within this AI infrastructure phase of development, right? It's scaling capability with the problems before. It
Mm.
looks like we're on the right trajectory. And then you can look at some of the policies that governments are bringing in. I mean, there was the elections here in the UK and the investment towards AI, etc. Slightly different, the Tories and Labour. We won't go into that in this call. Maybe another one.
That's
Um,
the next week, I think.
that's for next week. But yeah, I mean, the trajectory looks good. We've just got to wait and see. But me and James aren't going to risk our $1 trillion that we have in our bank. I think we're going to save it for something else.
I think that's the wisest thing you said today. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, any closing words, James, or before we shoot?
No, I think we've got no special guest this week just because of various holidays and stuff. But we get back to some guests from next week onwards, and we've got some really exciting guests lined up for the rest of the summer and into the autumn. But please, the only thing I would say is we are open to all feedback and suggestions. So please drop us a line if there's anything that you think we should cover or anyone you think we should have on the show, or indeed whether, if you're listening and you'd like to come on the show, just drop us a line. And also, if you can spare a few minutes to leave a review on your chosen podcast player, it really, really helps us. So, whether that's just to give a star, that takes a few seconds, or to leave an actual review, we'd be eternally grateful, won't we?
Excellent. And just to follow up on that, guys, all the topics that we typically speak on are from our newsletter. So go in and sign up for that. I mean, there's a lot more in this week. I mean, there was a mention of generative AI within Google Maps and loads of other news, which is catching attention. So go check that out. And then you'll get the information before we cover in the podcast. So you can come in with a more of an informative view before me and James start to ramble on the different topics. Otherwise, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.